Welcome to Hollywood Minute. I'm Name.
It's SheTV!
Remember those forgotten TV show spin-offs? The ones that flopped so badly, no one talks about them anymore? In the 1990s, these shows came from hits we watched every week, hoping the magic would last just a little longer. But when the spark faded, what else did we lose with it? Do you remember when the Golden Girls wrapped up and left behind this empty chair at the table? The kind of chair you do not even notice until someone like B. Arthur is not sitting in it anymore? The Golden Palace tried to pull a fast one on us, sliding the rest of the girls into a Miami hotel and hoping we would not notice that Dorothy was missing. But we noticed. Oh, we noticed. It is like walking into your favorite diner only to find they changed the whole menu and expect you to smile through it. You just cannot fake that kind of chemistry, and this spin-off proved it real fast. Back in the 1990s, television was chasing that spin-off magic like it was buried treasure. If a show had characters that even remotely clicked with viewers, execs were already drawing up contracts to give them their own vehicle. The Golden Girls was lightning in a bottle. Every Sunday, families across the country tuned in not just for laughs, but for that warm hug the show somehow gave you through a screen. When the series ended in 1992, it felt like closing a chapter of the family scrapbook, but someone forgot to tell the network it was okay to let go. Enter the Golden Palace, a spin-off that shuffled Rose, Blanche, and Sophia into the hospitality industry. Sounds fun on paper, but once you stepped through the lobby doors, something was off. B. Arthur, who played Dorothy with a level of dry wit that could slice through concrete, chose not to return. And no matter how many palm trees they planted around the hotel set, you could feel that absence like a missing tooth in a smile. They brought in some fresh faces, of course, including Don Cheadle and Cheech Marin, both of whom were genuinely trying to give the show new legs. But it is hard to dance when you are missing a beat. The show focused on running a hotel, but instead of highlighting friendship and wisdom aging gracefully, it got caught up in sitcom fluff. It lost the realness, the grit, the layered tenderness that made the Golden Girls a cultural landmark. The ratings started off with curiosity-fueled interest, but dipped like a cheap mattress by episode 6. There were some episodes that tried to recapture the spark, even bringing Dorothy back for a visit. But by then, the damage was done. Fans knew this was not the same magic. It was like microwaving leftovers and pretending it is a fresh-cooked meal. The Golden Palace ran for one season. That is it. And maybe that is all it ever needed to be. A reminder that sometimes the story is finished when the credits roll, and dragging it out only dims what was once brilliant. People wanted to love it. Some probably even convinced themselves they did. But in the end, it is one of those shows we remember not because it stayed with us, but because it quietly faded away. Just long enough to say, "Oh yeah, that happened," and then move on. Let us talk about Baywatch Nights, a show that looked at its older sibling and said, what if instead of lifeguards, we chase ghosts? And I'm not joking. That is basically what happened. You take Baywatch, which is already absurd in the best way, and then you ask, but what if we made it spooky? You end up with a spin-off that makes you sit there, blinking at your television, wondering if someone switched the channel when you were not looking. It started out tame enough. Mitch Buchanan, yes, David Hasselhoff himself, trades his red rescue trunks for a flashlight and a trench coat. The first season of Baywatch Nights had Mitch solving regular detective-style crimes in a beachside setting. That is already a little bit of a stretch, but hey, people love a good crime mystery, and we already trusted Mitch to save lives, so why not let him solve a few break-ins and burglaries too? But then came season 2. Oh boy, that is when everything just flew off the rails and into the fog. Suddenly, Mitch is chasing vampires. He is fighting sea monsters. There are shadowy government conspiracies. I am not even kidding. One episode has him dealing with alien parasites. It went from sunny lifeguard drama to budget X-Files in the blink of an eye. And audiences? They were confused. They tuned in expecting slow-motion beach jogs and lifeguard heroics, not werewolf autopsies. See, the problem was, Baywatch worked because it knew exactly what it was. cheesy, sun-drenched escapism with a dash of heroism, but Baywatch Nights forgot the assignment. It tried to pivot into something edgy, dark, and supernatural, but without the writing or tone to make that shift believable. The result? Something that felt like fan fiction written during a power outage. Even David Hasselhoff could not save this one, and you could tell halfway through the second season that everyone involved was just trying to hold the ship together. The camera work got shakier. The plots got stranger. It stopped feeling like a television show and more like a fever dream someone had after eating bad seafood. By the time it was canceled, no one was surprised. It had become the kind of thing people mentioned in passing with a wince, like a regrettable tattoo or a bad high school haircut. "Remember when Baywatch tried to do ghost stories?" they would say, shaking their heads. And yet, there is something almost admirable about how bold it was. It swung big. It reached for something weird and wild. It just happened to completely flop in the process. Today, it is a footnote in the long, tan-lined legacy of Baywatch, a forgotten detour into the strange where lifeguards became detectives and the beach became haunted. There is something really eerie about watching a character you loved in one show suddenly feel lost in another. Time of Your Life was supposed to be the big moment for Sarah Reeves Marin, played by Jennifer Love Hewitt, the brooding, sensitive heart of Party of Five. You remember her, right? The girl who wore oversized sweaters like armor and always looked like she had a dozen sad poems in her back pocket. Well, Fox thought she could carry her own show, and in 1999, they gave her the spotlight. But here is the thing. Not every supporting character is meant to be a lead. The show dropped Sarah into New York City, a place that is not exactly known for cradling the lost and tender. She moves there to search for her biological father, and on the surface, it had all the right ingredients. Big city dreams, emotional backstory, a cast of quirky new friends. But it never found its rhythm. The emotional current of Party of Five came from its ensemble, a family unit, raw and real, all leaning on each other through grief and growing pains. Time of Your Life stripped that away and left Sarah adrift in plot lines that felt more like filler than foundation. And do not get me wrong, Jennifer Love Hewitt gave it everything. She was America's sweetheart at the time, magnetic and vulnerable in a way that made you want to root for her. But the writing just did not back her up. The new cast around her felt like caricatures more than characters. There was the hot neighbor, the wise older mentor, the awkward best friend. All fine on paper, but they never gelled. It was like watching someone try to build a house with puzzle pieces from a dozen different boxes. The show also had a weird relationship with time. It was called Time of Your Life, but nobody ever really seemed to be having one. The pacing was glacial, and episodes wandered aimlessly, sometimes focusing too much on side characters that no one had invested in. Instead of growing Sarah's story, it often felt like it was trying to stretch a single emotional beat across 40 minutes of airtime. Worse, the network didn't know what to do with it either. After a decent premiere, the ratings dropped like a lead balloon. Fox pulled it after just a few episodes, then brought it back months later, hoping nobody would notice the awkward pause. But people noticed. By then, most had moved on. In the end, only 19 episodes aired, and it quietly slipped into the vault of shows that could have been something, if only they understood what made the original work in the first place. It is the kind of series people vaguely recall when they hear Jennifer Love Hewitt's name and say, "Wait, didn't she have a show after Party of Five?" And then they shrug. Because it is hard to hold on to something that never really held on to you. Now let's talk about Joey. Yes, that Joey, as in Joey Tribbiani, 1/6 of the friends we all spent a decade quoting. It might be easy to forget now, but there was a moment, a real moment, when NBC thought Joey was going to be their next giant, a ratings juggernaut, a sitcom for the new millennium. After all, Friends had just wrapped up in 2004 and people were still riding the high. Who would not want more Joey, right? Well, turns out, almost everybody. On Friends, Joey was the lovable doofus. He was charming because he was surrounded by a whole gang of characters who balanced him out. Chandler's sarcasm, Monica's control issues, Rachel's romantic chaos. On his own? Joey was like a single slice of pizza served on a plate. Still pizza, sure, but kind of sad without the rest of the pie. The premise was simple enough. Joey moves to Los Angeles to pursue his acting career and reconnect with family. He gets a new apartment, a nerdy nephew, a sarcastic sister, and a few awkward neighbors. But the magic was gone. Gone was Central Perk, the crowded New York charm, the tangled friendships that gave every episode of Friends its emotional core. Joey tried to fill that with punchlines about auditions and sitcom misunderstandings, but it felt forced, like watching someone do karaoke of a show they used to star in. What hurt most was the chemistry, or rather, the absence of it. None of the new cast clicked the way the Friends cast did, and that is not even their fault. You cannot fake 10 years of history, inside jokes, and perfectly timed one-liners. No matter how hard Joey tried, it felt like trying to build lightning from leftover parts. The jokes, too, often fell flat. Joey's character leaned so hard into the dumb but lovable persona that it started to feel one note. Without the counterbalance of smarter, sharper characters, his flaws became the center of attention rather than the punchline to a deeper, more relatable story. You watched it hoping to see some of that old charm peek through, maybe a phone call from Chandler or a surprise visit from Phoebe. But those moments were rare and never enough. And slowly, the audience faded. The first episode had over 18 million viewers. By the second season, it was half that, and dropping. NBC pulled the plug before the season even finished airing, leaving several episodes unaired in the United States. What is funny, though, is how Joey became a kind of time capsule, a perfect example of how spin-offs can look great on paper but fall apart in practice. You cannot just take the breakout comic relief and expect them to carry an entire show. Joey reminds us that sometimes magic only works when everyone's at the table. And when you take one piece out and try to give it a spotlight of its own, all it does is cast a shadow. Let us say you are flipping through the channels one night in the early 1990s and land on a show that looks vaguely familiar. The faces, the house, even the name. The Bradies. You think, wait, is this a Brady Bunch reunion? But then someone starts talking about divorce. Someone else is struggling with infertility. And one of the kids is paralyzed in a car crash. You sit there stunned, halfway between laughing and blinking, wondering how the Brady Bunch turned into a soap opera overnight. The Bradies was supposed to be the big return of America's most cheerful blended family, a revival for grown-up audiences who remembered the original as safe, sweet, and full of perfectly timed lessons. But this reboot did not just age up the kids, it dragged the whole tone through a midlife crisis. Gone were the corny gags and sunny misunderstandings. In their place were heavy issues, serious drama, and emotional whiplash so sharp it could give you whiplash in real life. Mike Brady was now a congressman. Carol was a real estate agent. Greg was a doctor. Marcia was an alcoholic. And Peter, poor Peter, was dating his boss, who also happened to be married. The show leaned hard into that early 90s real issues energy, but forgot that what made the Brady Bunch work was its predictability. The problems were never too scary. The kids were always okay. The show made you feel like everything could be solved with a family meeting and a plate of cookies. The Bradies was not trying to comfort anyone. It wanted to be modern. It wanted to be edgy. And that is where it tripped over its own bell-bottoms. The audience who had grown up with the Bradies did not want to see their childhood heroes stuck in melodrama. And the younger crowd had no clue who these people were or why they were supposed to care. To be fair, the actors gave it their all. Almost the entire original cast returned, including Robert Reed and Florence Henderson. And you could tell they believed in it. They looked older, sure, but still had that chemistry, that warmth. Somewhere in there under all the misdirection and made-for-television pain. The show aired as part of a short-lived attempt to reboot the franchise through a series of television movies and weekly episodes. But it never gained traction. Ratings dropped fast. People tuned in out of curiosity and left out of discomfort. It is hard to watch Greg Brady talk about malpractice lawsuits without feeling like someone just dumped cold water on your Saturday morning memories. By the time it was pulled from the schedule, only 6 episodes had aired. It became one of those odd trivia facts. Did you know the Brady Bunch had a dark, dramatic reboot? And people would shake their heads half in disbelief. If nothing else, the Bradies taught us that nostalgia is a fragile thing. You cannot just paint it in darker colors and expect it to shine. Sometimes the past is best left where it was, in the backyard, with a football flying at Marcia's nose and a laugh track we did not realize we would miss so much. Models Inc. walked onto the 1990s television scene like it was ready to strut. A spin-off of Melrose Place, which was already a spin-off of Beverly Hills 90210, this was soap royalty trying to extend its reign. It had glamour, it had backstabbing, it had shoulder pads that could cut glass. But what it did not have, somehow, was soul. The premise was promising. A Los Angeles modeling agency run by Hillary Michaels, played by the Queen herself, Linda Gray. She was the mother of Amanda Woodward, Heather Locklear's character from Melrose Place. And with that kind of family tree, you would expect drama, secrets, maybe a few champagne glasses thrown across a room. Instead, Models Inc. offered a glittery surface without much underneath. Every character looked like they belonged on a magazine cover, which made sense given the setting. But after a few episodes, it started to feel like watching mannequins try to emote. The dialogue was stiff. The plot lines were recycled. A model goes missing. Another has a drug problem. Someone sleeps with someone else's boyfriend. The problem is not that these stories cannot work. They absolutely can. But Models Inc. never gave us a reason to care. Soap operas live and die by their characters. You can throw all the plot twists you want at an audience, but if the people delivering them do not connect, nothing sticks. That was the issue here. Melrose Place had fire because it had Amanda. It had Kimberly. It had chaos that felt personal. Models Inc. had drama, sure, but it felt like it came from a script generator. There was one plotline that tried to go full thriller, a masked murderer targeting models, and that did shake things up. But even that felt more like desperation than innovation. Like someone in the writer's room said, "What if we just make this a murder mystery?" And everyone else nodded because they were out of ideas. The show struggled from the beginning with ratings. It never really found its footing, especially airing in a slot that put it up against some heavy competition. The network gave it time, even shuffled around episodes and tried to boost it with crossovers, but nothing stuck. By the time Models Inc. was canceled, only 29 episodes had aired. And even though some fans fought for it, the general consensus was clear. This one did not work. It looked the part, sounded the part, even moved like a primetime soap, but it was all surface. No heat, no hook. Today, it exists more as a relic than a memory. A show that had every chance to shine but somehow slipped right through the cracks in its stilettos. You might stumble on a rerun or a clip and think, "Oh yeah, this was supposed to be the next big thing." And then you will keep scrolling, because it just never gave us a reason to stay. If you blinked sometime around 1993, you probably missed The Torkelsons, Almost Home. And to be honest, even if your eyes were wide open, it still might have slipped past you. This was not just a show that failed to stick. It was a show that tried to reinvent itself halfway through and somehow made itself even easier to forget. It is one of those cases where a network had something mildly charming on their hands, panicked when the ratings dipped, and decided the answer was to throw everything in the moving truck and pray for the best. Spoiler alert, it did not work. The original Torkelsons was a sweet little slice of life about a struggling single mom raising 5 kids in small-town Oklahoma. It had heart, it had awkward teen drama, and it had one of the most distinctive narrating voices you will ever hear in a sitcom. Literally. The daughter, Dorothy Jane, delivered poetic voiceovers from her bedroom window like a Southern Hallmark philosopher. And yeah, it was a bit corny, but that was kind of the point. It felt grounded, the kind of show that gave you warm feelings even if it never cracked into primetime glory. But then came the reboot, and not even the kind that tries to hide what it is. Nope. They called it Almost Home, slapped it on the schedule, and hoped you would not ask too many questions about what happened to half the cast. Gone were two of the original kids. Gone was the Oklahoma setting. The show was picked up for a second season and reimagined as a sitcom about a family moving in with a wealthy woman in Seattle. Same mom, same Dorothy Jane, completely new vibe. The shift was jarring. All the quirky charm of a small-town family scraping by was replaced with a sort of generic fish-out-of-water storyline that felt like a completely different show. It tried to do the rich meets poor trope, but without the bite or balance. The characters were flatter. The tone lost its identity. Even the heartfelt window monologues got toned down, which was like stripping Linus of his security blanket. And here is the thing. Almost Home was not terrible. It just had no real reason to exist in the form it took. Fans of the original Torkelsons felt alienated, and new viewers had no context for why they should care. The network was clearly chasing a broader audience, but all they did was lose the small one they already had. And the new cast additions, including a young Brittany Murphy, were not enough to pull it out of its identity crisis. It lasted 13 episodes under the Almost Home banner before it quietly disappeared from the schedule. No big finale, no fanfare, just another case of a show being pulled before it ever found out who it wanted to be. These days, it lives in that weird space of, wait, was that real? Television memories? And for anyone who loved the Torkelsons, it is kind of bittersweet. A reminder that not every show needs to change to succeed. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is stay where your roots are. Let us go back a little further, all the way to 1989, and talk about Living Dolls, a sitcom that could only have come out of a very specific moment in television history. If you have never heard of it, do not worry. Most people have not. It aired for just a handful of episodes, left no real impact, and yet it somehow became a piece of trivia legend for one simple reason. It marked the television debut of Halle Berry. Yep, that Halle Berry. But even she could not save this show from itself. Living Dolls was a spin-off of Who's the Boss, a show that actually did have a cultural footprint. In one episode of Who's the Boss, teenage model Samantha Micelli, played by Alyssa Milano, visits a modeling agency run by a woman named Trish Carlin. That episode was the backdoor pilot. Someone at the network thought, hey, what if we made a whole series about teenage models living together in New York under the guidance of a no-nonsense house mother? And so Living Dolls was born. The premise sounds like it should be campy fun. Models with big dreams, clashing personalities, and fashion drama. But in reality, it played like a watered-down after-school special, trying to balance moral lessons with lightweight sitcom beats. The tone was all over the place. Was it a critique of the modeling industry? A comedy about friendship? A coming-of-age story? It could not decide, and neither could the audience. Michael Learned, best known as the mom from the Waltons, played Trish, the maternal anchor to the group of girls. She tried her best to give the show some gravitas, but the scripts were so clunky it was like watching someone recite heartfelt dialogue while standing on a treadmill. Meanwhile, Halle Berry, playing a confident, ambitious model named Emily, clearly had something. You can see it, even in those early episodes. The charisma was there, but the show was not built to support anyone shining too brightly. Critics were lukewarm. Ratings were ice cold. Only 12 episodes were produced and only 9 of those actually aired. The rest vanished into the archive void. And yet, Living Dolls still pops up in conversation once in a while. Usually not for its content, but because people love rediscovering that one of the biggest stars in the world got her start there. It is like finding an old yearbook photo of someone who went on to win an Oscar. Nostalgic, funny, a little embarrassing, but also kind of sweet. In the end, Living Dolls is not remembered because it was good. It is remembered because it flopped, hard, and because even in the middle of a mess, sometimes you catch the first glimpse of greatness. If you were watching television in the early 1990s and happened to catch a cartoon about crime-solving fish wearing trench coats, you were not hallucinating. That was Fish Police, and yes, it really aired on primetime network television. Right after The Simpsons exploded into a pop culture phenomenon, every network wanted a piece of that animated pie. The thinking was, people want edgy cartoons now. Grown-up humor in a cartoon? That is what the kids like. And so CBS took a big swing, with anthropomorphic seafood in a murky noir setting. It went about as well as you're imagining. Fish Police was based on a cult comic book, and to its credit, it was ambitious. It was weird, stylish, and tonally all over the place. Imagine a crime drama set underwater with a grizzled fish detective named Inspector Gill, voiced by none other than John Ritter. His femme fatale ex-girlfriend, a fish lounge singer named Angel, voiced by JoBeth Williams. Throw in a mob boss named Biscotti Calamari, and you start to get the idea. This was Chinatown meets SpongeBob, with the emotional range of neither. It had everything you might expect from a show trying to be edgy in 1992. Moody jazz soundtrack, innuendos wrapped in seaweed puns, and an art style that probably looked amazing on a storyboard but kind of terrifying in motion. The animation was dark, grainy, and flat, more like a motion comic than a fluid cartoon. Kids tuning in were confused. Adults did not know what to make of it. And the network? Probably panicked by week 2. The thing is, Fish Police wanted to be a smart satire, but never figured out who it was talking to. It was not funny enough to pull in fans of The Simpsons, and it was way too weird and niche for mainstream audiences. You could feel it trying, grasping for a tone somewhere between sultry detective mystery and cartoon hijinks, but never really finding the middle ground. One minute you were watching a joke about clamshell bras, and the next minute someone was being gunned down in a rain-soaked alley. It was like watching an identity crisis in Technicolor. Only 3 episodes ever aired on CBS before they yanked it off the schedule. 3. That is not even enough time to figure out if the thing was any good. Though, to be honest, it probably was not. They had made 6 total episodes, but the remaining 3 did not see the light of day in the United States until years later, long after the network quietly buried it under a pile of failed experiments. Today, it lives in the trivia graveyard, the kind of thing someone brings up when they want to stump a room full of television buffs. Do you remember Fish Police? They will ask, and most people will think they are joking. But nope, it happened. It aired. And then it disappeared as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only confusion, a few VHS tapes, and the faint echo of underwater saxophone. There is forgotten television, and then there is SheTV, a show so brief, so completely buried by time, that even people who were on it probably hesitate when you bring it up. Born out of NBC's early 1990s push to expand its comedy empire, SheTV was meant to be a fresh, female-led answer to Saturday Night Live, sketch comedy with a new perspective. But instead of feeling like the next step forward for women in television comedy, it landed like a knockoff handbag at a real designer party. Aired in the summer of 1994, SheTV was a short-lived variety sketch show starring women, and that was pretty much the entire pitch. It featured a small cast of up-and-coming comedians, including Megan Cavanagh from A League of Their Own, and tried to deliver topical humor with a feminist edge. But what it delivered instead was a string of sketches that felt like recycled SNL leftovers, minus the timing and polish. It was one of those shows where you could see the idea working, in theory, but every single part of the execution came up short. The writing was uneven, the sketches lacked punch, and the editing, made everything feel like it was being performed underwater. Even jokes that might have landed in a livelier setting were robbed of their spark by awkward cuts and pacing that dragged like a ball and chain. You watched it not with laughter, but with a kind of second-hand embarrassment. That sinking feeling where you want something to succeed, but know in your gut it is just not going to get there. Part of the problem was the timing. In the mid-90s, television still treated sketch comedy as something you had to build slowly, over time. Saturday Night Live took years to become a powerhouse. In Living Color succeeded because it had sharp writing and a bold identity. SheTV never got a chance to find its voice, and worse, never showed signs of having one in the first place. It leaned on broad characters, worn-out premises, and the occasional musical number that seemed more like filler than feature. And then there was the marketing, or lack thereof. NBC did not really know how to sell SheTV. It dumped the show into a weird midsummer slot when no one was really watching television, promoted it sparingly, and seemed to hope it might just magically go viral before the term viral meant anything. Instead, it came and went like a commercial break. 6 episodes aired. 6. That was all it took for the network to decide it had seen enough. No reruns, no DVD release, no cult following. What makes it even sadder is that SheTV had the bones of something worthwhile. A sketch comedy show with a mostly female cast was rare at the time, and there was a real opportunity to carve out a space for smart, character-driven comedy from a different lens. But the show was so unsure of itself, so desperate to be funny without knowing what kind of funny it wanted to be, that it never left any kind of mark. Now it exists only in fragments, a name in a Wikipedia list. In the end, SheTV did not just flop, it vanished. And in doing so, it became a kind of warning that even when television tries to push forward, it still needs a point of view, strong writing, and a reason for people to care. Without those, all you are left with is a title and a silent room. It had glitz, it had charm, and it had the Las Vegas Strip, but it never had the audience. Who's Watching the Kids was a sitcom that centered on 2 aspiring showgirls trying to make it big in Sin City while raising their younger siblings in the process. The idea alone seemed like a classic blend of heartfelt family drama and zany showbiz antics. It had neon, sequins, and sass, along with the tried-and-true formula of mismatched roommates balancing dreams and responsibility. But the series never found its footing. The humor felt thin. The stories leaned heavily on awkward misunderstandings and slapstick gags that even the laugh track could not salvage. The kids were mostly relegated to the background, and the adult characters lacked the warmth that audiences were used to from family-centric shows. NBC hoped it would capture the same lightning that made Laverne and Shirley a hit, especially since it came from the same producers. But it missed the heart, and it missed the timing. Audiences in the late 1970s were already shifting toward more grounded, character-driven sitcoms. The over-the-top Vegas flair and cartoonish setups just felt out of touch. Ratings declined quickly. After only 11 episodes, the show was quietly pulled. It has since faded into near-total obscurity. For a show that promised both showbiz sparkle and family tenderness, it managed to deliver neither. Watching it now feels like digging up a discarded script from a past that tried too hard to be funny without ever being real. A footnote in television history, barely remembered, but maybe, just maybe, that is for the best. Super Train was a show that promised the future and delivered a train wreck. Literally. Picture this, a massive nuclear-powered train that had everything from gyms to swimming pools to full-blown nightclubs, speeding across America like a landlocked spaceship. It was NBC's answer to The Love Boat, except instead of a cruise, you were on rails. And instead of smooth sailing, it was a multi-million-dollar gamble that crashed and burned faster than anyone expected. The production budget was astronomical for its time, higher than anything else on television in 1979. They even built a giant set and miniature models for the train itself. But viewers, they just didn't show up. The stories on board were supposed to be romantic and dramatic and weekly anthologies, but the scripts were flat and the characters forgettable. It aired on Sunday nights, and NBC had high hopes that it would become the next big thing. Instead, Super Train became the poster child for overambition. Critics tore it apart, and within a few months, it was gone. Still, for a show that failed so spectacularly, it left behind something rare. Footage that looks like retrofuturism exploded all over your screen. It's wild, lavish sets, bright lights, an entire casino inside a train. You cannot look away. It's hard not to respect just how bold it was, even if it collapsed under its own weight. Super Train was flashy, short-lived, and unforgettable for all the wrong, and maybe just a few right, reasons. There was something disarmingly genuine about brotherly love. Maybe it was because the 3 brothers on screen, Joey, Matthew, and Andrew Lawrence, were real brothers in real life. Or maybe it was because the show never tried too hard. It just let the relationships speak for themselves. Set in Philadelphia, the series followed Joe Roman, a motorcycle-riding older brother who returns home after their father's death to help raise his two younger half-brothers and manage the family business. It was not flashy. It was not trying to reinvent the sitcom. It was just about a broken family trying to make things work. And somehow, that made it feel like everything. Joe was rough around the edges but protective. Matt was the overachiever with a heart too big for his age. Andy was the comic relief and the emotional glue. Together, they rebuilt more than just a business. They rebuilt trust. They rebuilt a family. Brotherly love hit differently because it did not pretend everything was fine. It showed grief without drowning in it, laughter without ignoring the pain, and it gave kids and parents alike a rare glimpse into what it means to show up for people, even when it is messy, especially when it is messy. The show was short-lived, barely 2 seasons, but it carved out a quiet place in the hearts of anyone who ever lost something and had to figure out how to move forward, one day at a time. Not all love looks perfect. Sometimes it just looks like 3 brothers under one roof, doing the best they can. There was a time when Teddy Ruxpin was more than just a toy. He was a phenomenon. The animatronic storytelling bear took bedrooms by storm in the mid-1980s, with his soft voice and moving eyes hypnotizing kids into thinking they had a new best friend. So when a cartoon was announced, expectations were sky high. The Adventures of Teddy Ruxpin was supposed to be the next big thing, but it never lived up to the hype. The show followed Teddy as he journeyed through the magical world of Grundo with his pals, Grubby the Caterpillar and Newton Gimmick, the absent-minded inventor. Together, they searched for ancient artifacts, uncovered secrets, and helped strangers in need. It sounds like a solid fantasy setup, but here is the problem. It was slow, painfully slow. The storytelling was so gentle and drawn out that it felt more like a bedtime story stretched across 20 minutes than a cartoon meant to compete with Transformers or Thundercats. There was also a disconnect between the toy and the show. The magic of the original Teddy Ruxpin was interactive. He read stories, he moved his mouth, he felt alive. The cartoon, on the other hand, was passive. You watched it, and it never gave you anything back. Without that interactivity, the whole thing felt hollow. The series had a decent run, 65 episodes, but it faded fast. By the late 1980s, Teddy Ruxpin the toy had also lost his place in toy aisles. The cartoon followed, vanishing into the growing pile of forgotten 1980s media. Teddy Ruxpin may have started as a friend you could trust, but his cartoon never quite earned the same warmth. "You're under arrest, sugar." That was the catchphrase that made America sit up and take notice, if only briefly. Get Christy Love was revolutionary in its time, featuring one of television's first black female leads in a crime drama. Teresa Graves starred as Christy Love, an undercover detective in a world that was still figuring out how to talk about race, power, and gender. She was smart, tough, stylish, and unforgettable. The show was based loosely on a made-for-television movie, which drew major buzz. ABC thought they had the next big hit on their hands, and for a moment, it seemed like they did. But then the cracks began to show. The scripts were formulaic, the action routine, and the production values limited. Christy Love was meant to be bold, but the stories rarely let her break out of tired cliches. Behind the scenes, Graves, who had converted to a religious faith, refused to participate in any scenes she felt were too violent or provocative. Creative clashes followed. The network struggled to find the right tone. Ratings dipped, and by the end of its first season, the show was gone. What should have been a trailblazer was reduced to a footnote. Still, Christy Love carved out a place in history. She opened a door that had been shut for too long, even if she did not get to walk all the way through it. Today, she is remembered more for what she represented than for the plots she solved. A symbol of potential unrealized, a legend born from a show that never had the chance to grow. The Colgate Comedy Hour was not just another variety show, it was an event. Airing live from 1950 to 1955, it brought the electric chaos of the stage directly into the homes of millions. Hosted by a rotating cast of comedy legends like Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Eddie Cantor, and Abbott and Costello, the show captured a kind of energy that no scripted sitcom ever could. It was unpredictable, unpolished, and wildly entertaining. Every week was a gamble, a new experiment in whether or not the comedians could top their last performance. And more often than not, they did. It was a golden age of television in the raw, where mistakes happened on air and the audience loved it more for that. You felt the tension in every live performance. Anything could go wrong, and sometimes it did. But that chaos made it human, alive, and impossible to turn away from. It was the only place where you could see slapstick, song, and celebrity all within the same breath. And at its best, it felt like the whole country was in on the joke at the same time. The competition with The Ed Sullivan Show was fierce, and at times it looked like Colgate might actually win. But time plays favorites, and while Ed Sullivan became immortal, Colgate Comedy Hour became something else, a memory. It disappeared almost as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving only clips and scattered references behind. Yet for those who watched it, those Sunday nights were unforgettable. You did not just laugh. You roared. You shouted across the room. You felt alive. It was theater, comedy, and chaos wrapped into 1 hour of brilliance. It was one of those shows that should have faded into parody, but somehow carved out a place in America's living rooms, and never really left. The Beverly Hillbillies followed the Clampett family, simple folks from the Ozarks who struck oil and suddenly found themselves living in a Beverly Hills mansion they could not understand, surrounded by wealth they never asked for. The comedy was obvious, their backward ways clashing with the glittering absurdity of high society. But beneath the laughs was something quieter, something almost tragic. This was a story about people who never quite fit in, no matter how big their bank account got. Jed Clampett, the soft-spoken patriarch, always seemed like he was looking for something he had lost, even as the world laughed around him. Granny's wild wisdom and Ellie Mae's innocence made them caricatures on the surface, but real to anyone who knew what it meant to be treated like a joke just for being different. And America watched, week after week, because it reminded us that not every outsider is looking to blend in. But then, just like that, the Clampetts were gone. One day they were gracing prime time, the next they were a punchline, buried beneath newer shows with shinier backdrops and faster jokes. The laugh track stopped, and no one asked why. Today, the Beverly Hillbillies exists mostly in rerun limbo, a relic with a twang, treated like a fossil of a simpler time. But if you remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet, watching Granny try to make moonshine in a millionaire's kitchen, then you remember what television used to be. Odd, imperfect, human. And sometimes, that was exactly what made it so rich.
Zorro is a name that once meant something. It conjured images of sword fights, masked justice, and Spanish colonial drama. But in 1981, the new Adventures of Zoro tried to bring that legacy to a new generation, and ended up slicing its own identity to ribbons. What should have been a swashbuckling revival turned into a forgettable shadow of the hero's former glory. The show wanted to be educational at times, injecting light history into the plot, but it always felt awkward and misplaced. Kids were not tuning in for Spanish colonial geography. They wanted heroes and high-stakes action. What they got was a watered-down vigilante with none of the spark that made the original stories iconic. The show only lasted for 1 season and left barely a footprint. It is rarely rerun, rarely referenced, and mostly remembered as a failed attempt to modernize a character that deserved better. In trying to make Zorro palatable for children, the show removed everything that made him legendary. It is proof that not every icon can be reborn through animation, and some legacies are better left untouched. The concept was pure late 60s brilliance. A group of idealistic college students crash land on a mysterious island where the adult world no longer exists. No teachers, no parents, no government, just a blank slate to rebuild society from scratch. The new people was meant to be bold, a mirror held up to the counterculture generation. It blended themes of Lord of the Flies and Gilligan's Island, but with a serious tone and moral undertones. And yet,
For all its ambition, the show never really worked. It aired on ABC as part of a half-hour drama experiment and never had time to breathe. Episodes felt rushed, ideas half-formed. The writing wrestled with big questions: freedom, power, equality, but the characters remained shallow and their struggles felt like debates rather than drama. The sets were plain, the stakes low. Viewers tuned in out of curiosity but quickly lost interest. Ratings sagged. The network gave it 17 episodes, but the cultural revolution it wanted to ignite never came. What should have been groundbreaking ended up feeling like a lecture. Even the cast, filled with fresh-faced newcomers, seemed lost in the tone shifts. There was potential in every frame, but no spark, no urgency, no heart. Today, The New People is more a forgotten experiment than a failure. One of those rare shows where the premise outshined every part of the execution. A utopia left unexplored. A generation's voice that never found the right words. Few shows dared to be as gentle and raw as the Waltons. In a television landscape growing louder and flashier, this quiet drama about a rural Virginia family during the Great Depression and World War II was an act of rebellion. It reminded us that the world did not need to be big to feel important. Watching the Waltons felt like returning to a house you never lived in but still knew by heart. The opening narration was a hug. The goodnight scenes at the end of each episode were a lullaby. The series followed the tight-knit Walton family, 7 children, 2 parents, 2 grandparents, and turned their small victories and heartaches into epic truths. When John Boy chased his dream of becoming a writer, when Mary Ellen faced life after loss, when the family sat around a dinner table with barely enough food but more than enough love, it was more than a story. It was a reflection. Somehow, a show about a family from another era became the emotional backbone of real families watching together in the 70s. But time is cruel. As new decades arrived, the Waltons faded. The world moved faster, and it stopped looking back. Now it exists mostly in boxed DVD sets and the whispered memories of people who remember what real family television used to feel like. They do not make shows like this anymore, because maybe they think we no longer need them. But the truth is, we do. Maybe now more than ever. The Many Loves of Dobby Gillis was not your average teenage sitcom. It aired from 1959 to 1963 and had one of the most unique voices of its time. This was a show about a lovesick young man who talked directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall long before it became a storytelling trend. Dobby was charming, hopelessly romantic, and always entangled in some absurd scheme to win over the girl of the week. But what made the show stand out even more was the presence of Maynard G. Krebs, played by Bob Denver, a beatnik sidekick who recoiled at the word work and became a cultural icon in his own right. The show was funny, sharp, and smarter than it often got credit for. It touched on real themes of class, ambition, and teenage rebellion, all wrapped in a light-hearted, lovable package. Dobby wasn't a rebel or a genius. He was something rarer, a sincere dreamer. He wanted love, he wanted meaning, and he wanted it without irony. It was the first time television said it was okay to be awkward, poetic, and hopeful at once. And it let teenagers be foolish without making them the punchline. It gave American youth a voice, an oddball voice maybe, but a voice nonetheless. Over time, though, it was overtaken by louder, brighter comedies and the rise of more dramatic fare. Dobby faded into the background, his monologues forgotten, his daydreams replaced by different kinds of heroes. But if you watched it, really watched it, you remember the warmth, the honesty, the way it made being young feel both ridiculous and profound. In the shadow of Thundercats and Silverhawks came Tiger Sharks, a cartoon that tried to dive deep but barely made a splash. Created by Rankin Bass, the same minds behind some of the most iconic 1980s action cartoons, Tiger Sharks was supposed to be their next big franchise. But unlike its feline and metallic siblings, this aquatic spin-off never found the current it needed to survive. It sank fast, and today, most people do not even know it existed. The setup was familiar. A group of heroes, half human, half sea creature, defended the underwater world of Water-O from evil alien pirates. They had a base, a mission, transformation sequences, and of course, a whole arsenal of water-themed powers and gadgets. But something about it just never came together. The characters were flat, their personalities barely distinguishable. You had Mako the leader, Dolph the dolphin guy, Octavia with her 8 arms, names that sound cooler than the characters ever were in action. The biggest problem, though, was timing. By 1987, kids had already chosen their champions. Thundercats roared, He-Man ruled, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were just around the corner. Tiger Sharks was too little, too late. It did not help that it was buried inside the comic strip, a syndicated package show that split attention between multiple series, making it harder to follow or care about any of them. It never got a toy line, never got reruns, and was never given a proper home video release. Tiger Sharks is the definition of forgotten, an ambitious but ultimately aimless swim through shallow waters. The idea was magic. A group of travelers, scientists, teens, mystics, find themselves trapped in a mysterious dimension where time and reality break down. They search for a way home, journeying through a series of strange lands, each with its own rules, cultures, and dangers. That was The Fantastic Journey. A mix of science fiction and fantasy, it was a show that promised discovery, imagination, and adventure. But what it delivered was something far more chaotic. Despite an ambitious premise, the show was never given the time or budget it needed to build its world. Sets looked recycled. The effects were underwhelming. The writing swerved between philosophical and campy, often within the same episode. One week they were battling telepathic overlords, the next week they were navigating a land of forgotten civilizations. It felt like 3 different shows fighting for control. Characters were introduced and dropped. Storylines never paid off. Even the lead actor was changed mid-season. NBC had hoped for a ratings hit, but the show struggled to build a consistent audience. Viewers were intrigued but also confused. What was the journey, really? Where were they going? And why did it feel like the writers were just as lost as the characters? After only 10 episodes, The Fantastic Journey was canceled. But in those few hours, it captured something unique, a wild, unpolished attempt to blend science fiction with mythology and metaphysics. It did not succeed, but it did not completely fail either. For some, it still lingers as a vivid memory of what television used to try before it learned to play things safe. A weird, winding path through television's stranger corners. The 20th Century Fox Hour was a short-lived attempt to bridge the golden age of cinema with the golden glow of television. Running from 1955 to 1957, it was an anthology series that adapted well-known films and original stories into hour-long television dramas. It was elegant, it was cinematic. It tried to carry the weight of the studio's name on its back and bring it straight into your living room. Each episode had a familiar polish to it, like watching a condensed movie but with all the grandeur still intact. Famous stories were trimmed down to fit into 60 minutes, and new dramas tried their best to live up to the brand that preceded them. Some succeeded, some did not. But even when it missed with grace. The lighting, the music, the framing, it all felt like a miniature film festival delivered to your living room. You did not watch it to laugh or relax, you watched it to watch. It reminded people that television could be art, not just noise. But every Sunday, viewers knew they were getting something a little more refined, a little more serious. In a world of variety shows and slapstick, the 20th Century Fox Hour felt like a whisper from the movie theater down the street. It was classy without being cold, dramatic without being dull. But the formula proved hard to sustain. The rise of sitcoms, westerns, and science fiction made its slower pacing feel out of step. Eventually, it quietly faded, unable to compete with the flashier new kids on the block. But it left behind a strange elegance, a kind of dignity that other shows rarely aimed for. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figalilli, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch, but it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. There is Forgotten, and then there is Rude Dog and the Dweebs. This show came out at the tail end of the 1980s and looked like someone dumped a bunch of neon paint onto a pile of rejected t-shirt designs. Rude Dog was meant to be cool. He had shades, he had a pink convertible, he talked in surfer slang. He was the embodiment of late 80s attitude, but even at the time, kids could smell the desperation. The premise was thin. Rude Dog ran an auto shop and hung out with a gang of other misfit dogs called the Dweebs. Each dweeb had a single personality trait and not much else. There was a nervous one, a tough one, a dumb one. You get the idea. They would go on adventures that usually involved outsmarting a grumpy dog catcher or fixing a car. None of it was funny. None of it made sense. The animation was loud and jittery, with jagged lines and garish colors that made it hard to even look at for more than 5 minutes. And Rude Dog himself was irritating. He was supposed to be rebellious and slick, but he just came across as smug and obnoxious. Parents hated the name. Critics hated the show. Even kids were unimpressed. It felt like a failed marketing ploy disguised as a television show. There was also something deeply cynical about the whole thing. Rude Dog was originally created for a clothing brand. This was not a show that started with a story or characters. It started with a logo, and you could feel it in every second of the cartoon. It had no heart, no soul, just marketing fumes. Rude Dog and the Dweebs was canceled quickly and buried even quicker. It is rarely mentioned even in the most in-depth retrospectives of 1980s animation. A relic of corporate desperation dressed up in neon fur. He could vanish with the push of a button. Gemini Man was a science fiction action show with a simple hook. A secret agent gains the ability to become invisible for short bursts of time. It was fast, sleek, and full of potential. But it never clicked. The lead, Ben Murphy, played Agent Sam Casey, a motorcycle-riding, beach-loving secret operative with a wristwatch that turned him transparent. The effects for their time were impressive. The idea had bite, but the scripts did not. Each episode followed the same basic arc. Invisible Man solves the case, reappears in time to deliver a wisecrack, and rides off into the sunset. There was little depth, no character growth, and the concept, while flashy, wore thin quickly. NBC launched the show with fanfare, but audiences were not impressed. The mid-70s were filled with science fiction experiments, and Gemini Man got lost in the noise. Ratings dipped. Critics shrugged, and after 11 episodes, it disappeared just like its protagonist. A few episodes were later re-edited into a television movie, but the series never returned. Invisibility, it turns out, is not much of a superpower when it comes to storytelling. Gemini Man was slick, but shallow. It promised adventure and gave us repetition. Today, it is remembered mostly by collectors and curious fans of retro sci-fi. A show that had all the right gadgets, but none of the spark. Another forgotten ghost of the broadcast era, flickering in and out of memory. Out of This World was the kind of show that could only exist in the 80s. A sitcom about a teenage girl who discovers on her 13th birthday that her father is an alien and she has supernatural powers. That sounds like something you'd find in the last row of a dusty VHS bargain bin, and honestly, that's the charm. This show somehow managed to blend heartwarming family moments, slapstick comedy, and intergalactic weirdness, all in one neon-washed package. It aired in syndication, which meant it never had a consistent time slot, but Sundays were a regular go-to in a lot of local markets. The lead character, Evie, had the power to freeze time by touching her index fingers together, a trick that was used so often it became one of the most recognizable gags of the show. The real kicker? Her alien dad, who you never actually saw, spoke to her through a glowing cube and was voiced by Burt Reynolds. Yes, that Burt Reynolds. It ran for 4 seasons, but because it was never a network darling and never had rerun deals, it kind of disappeared once the final episode aired. Ask anyone who remembers it and they'll light up with nostalgia, then immediately question if it was a dream. It was campy. It was bizarre. And it was something truly, uniquely 80s. Out of This World might have vanished from the spotlight, but for those who saw it, it never left their memories. Got a favorite flop or one we missed? Drop it in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more TV deep dives.